Hello and welcome. This is a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld.org. We continue our podcast about the war, full-scale war which Russia unleashed against Ukraine. The series is brought to you by Internews Ukraine and Ukraine Crisis Media Center, two Ukrainian media NGOs. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a chief editor of UkraineWorld.org. I'm joined by Tatiana Harkova, who is in charge of international outreach of Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Hello, Tanya.
Hello.
So we are making this podcast at our home. This creates this specific, very cozy image, but of course we continue to reflect about the war, about the atrocities, about everything which is going on. You can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. So today we want to talk about very general issues, and the question is, why has Russia started this horrible war against Ukraine? What is the first answer for you?
Putin's Russia exhausted all other resources to control Ukraine. What they did in 2014, when they annexed Crimea and a part of Ukrainian Donbass, it was an attempt to control over Ukraine politically, because after that, we had all this Normandy format, these Minsk agreements, Minsk I, Minsk II, all these negotiations with France and Germany, Ukraine and Russia for many years. And their idea was to gain the control over Ukraine in a kind of a diplomatic way. And then they failed. And this is not by chance, this is not accidental, that the last attempt to talk in this Minsk format, over this Minsk format, the last failure was several weeks before this invasion. What Putin did before, it was a kind of a political attempts to control over Ukraine with gas wars, which lasted for many years. We do remember that. So it was a kind of political attempts in Yanukovych times. Then failure because Yanukovych fled the country, so Euromaidan and the end of the story. So another attempt was with this diplomatic. And when they exhausted all their resources, the only way for Russia to control Ukraine was this military way. And
so let's summarize. So the first, I think, if we go back like in 1991, I think one of the illusions of the Western world was to think that the Soviet Union empire is collapsed. Whereas at the same time, I think that there was a silent agreement in the Western world that it should be allowed to exist in a certain form. Not in the form of the centralized empire, but in a form of the quasi-feudal model in which there is a center in Moscow and then like vassal states like Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, etc.
What we call zone of influence.
Then there were different forms of controlling these independent states through economics, of course, but also through energy. Since 2006, at least, after the Orange Revolution, several years after the Orange Revolution, we have witnessed the gas wars, to cut the gas supplies to Europe, to accuse Ukraine, etc. And nobody really believed, well, in Ukraine, nobody really, in the West, nobody really believed in Ukrainian narrative that it was all a means of Russian gain.
And look,
right?
Not only with Ukraine, so that's you are making the right point, because the game was the same with Moldova and with Georgia. In Moldova, we witnessed all these events in Transnistria in 92. So it was also a way to control former republic. And then in Georgia as well, with all these two so-called republics in 2000.
It was already in early 90s, right? So It was already attempts to control it militarily through creating these military enclaves, the frozen conflicts, etc. Then there was this economic war. Then there was this gas war. Then there were attempts to put, as you said, the leader, the puppet leader like Yanukovych. Then after it failed, they tried to make an influence in Ukraine, the political influence through the people like Medvedchuk.
Through diplomacy and also through François Hollande and Angela Merkel. So, I mean, talking to people and pushing Ukraine to a kind of this hybrid peace. I mean, so everybody is okay with Crimea annexed, and everybody is okay about part of Ukrainian Donbass annexed. And now we are talking about the conditions, how to get the ceasefire and how Ukraine would get back these territories without the real control. What does it mean? So it's about sovereignty, because if you get back territories you don't really control. I mean, from military point of view, it means that you become a kind of a part of Russia, because Russia controls people who vote in the territories, and they vote for central government, they vote for presidents, they vote for parliament, they have their voice in these geopolitical choices like NATO or whatever, European Union. So 3 million of people lived in the territories occupied by Russia in 2014. I mean, only in Donbass and Lugansk only. And then 2 millions in Crimea. But Crimea got back to Russia directly. So it is a huge amount of people. It's a big part. I would say almost 10, maybe not 10%, but I don't know, 8% of population. It's a lot. So it could be decisive.
After this economic blackmail, gas blackmail, attempts to impose the puppet government, there was this attempt to just anchor Ukraine through these puppet republics, right? It also didn't work. So indeed, you're right, the military option was the last resort.
Desperate attempts.
And interestingly, or paradoxically, or dramatically, tragically, the military aggression against Ukraine is a sign of Russian weakness, that it has exhausted all other means to control this country, all the soft power means, or whatever it might be. Let's try to go deeper. So we discussed this recent past, but for many people, like, what is Ukraine? Ukraine started to exist in 1991. Nobody knows about the history of Ukrainian independence in early 20th century. Nobody cared about Ukraine during the Versailles Treaty. But let's try to fill this gap. If you were to describe the different difficult relations between Ukrainians and Russians for the last several centuries, how would you describe them?
The first thing I would say here is that everything started in Kiev. So everything, the story of Ukraine and Russia started in Kiev in the early 9th, 10th centuries, and Rus was here, Kiev was the center of that, and Moscow appeared much later. And it's not a surprise that this is a beginning, this is a heart in a kind of this civilization. And that's why later in history we see these attempts of Moscow to control Kiev, to bring it back to this bigger empire in a way. And we do remember all these attempts to control, to erase any kind of differences. When we read Putin, so we were busy reading his articles, he stated many times that Ukraine is something artificial. It means that, what does it mean that it's artificial? It means that it doesn't exist in nature. This is not something organic, not something authentic, not something real, not something historical. So he was claiming, for example, that Lenin created this artificial state in the beginning of the 20th century. But the truth is that Russia is a kind of second state in this story with Kiev, and the relationship between Kiev and Moscow is that Moscow comes after Kiev. So for him is to describe Ukraine as a kind of a deviation from this common history. And we all experience that attitude of Russians even in our days. They look at Ukrainians like a fake copy of real people, fake copy of Russians. So, and when they called Ukrainians for many centuries Malorossi, small Russians, so like fake, not real copies of Russian. This is an attempt to hide the reality and the roots, and that's why Ukraine, in a way, is much more important for Russia than Georgia and Moldova, because this is about common history. And what they were trying to show during all the centuries, 19th century, 18th century, is that Ukraine doesn't exist.
This was a paradoxical logic of thinking, the line of thinking. They were saying that Ukrainians don't exist, that they're actually Russians. But why they cared so much about this? Because for them, Ukraine was the center of Russia. Ukraine was a place where their idea of Russia started. For our European audience, for example, it would be the same as, for example, Germans would say that, well, parts of the Benelux countries and France are actually Germany because it was a place of Carolingian Empire in the same time, like the 9th and 10th century. So the parallel is very clear, and there is also a parallel between the relations with Byzantine, with Rome, etc. They are really obsessed with this idea that Ukrainians is not a real nation because they themselves understand that they would be not Russians in their sense of the term without Kiev. And they need Ukrainians so much to fill in the void which exists in their own conception of Russian and Russians, etc. Because Russia, we can actually say that they're claiming that Ukrainians are artificial because Russians themselves are in many aspects artificial. It's not a nation state. It's not Russian is not a ethnicity because it's combines so many different ethnicities: the Ugrophins, the Mongoloids like Buryats, the Turkic people like Bashkirs and Tatars and all the rest, and Caucasians, of course. And this creates certain void, this imperial void. So basically, this is a complex. This is their complex, this complex of weakness.
They feel kind of a lack of identity, but instead of establishing a normal relationship and admit these common roots, why not? They try to appropriate, as they did for many centuries with Ukrainian culture. Recent stories we've already discussed many times. They're trying to appropriate everything, maybe the best masterpieces of Ukrainian culture, just to claim it was Russian because it happened in Russian Empire. So everything which was Ukrainian, it was a kind of provincial. But the best were going to Moscow for many centuries. Sure enough, and nothing changed in Soviet times. In Soviet times, also Ukraine was a kind of a republic, important republic. Not maybe even maybe more important than Moldova in a way, one of the biggest republics, one of the most richest republics, but always on the second place after Russia. This war is not about the strength of Putin. This is about their weakness. I mean, ideological on the level of ideas, on the level of ideology, and also about vision of future. History for Putin is extremely important, maybe because of age. We can reflect on that, saying that look, the difference between Putin and Zelensky, so it's difference in generations as well. So he is 70, he's approaching 70 years old. Somebody should think about eternal things, about maybe meaning of life, about the trace in history he would leave, something like that. And history for him is a kind of very important subject. Maybe even if he is completely wrong in what he is stating, history is still important for him. And he is already thinking about history. And that's why he feels that historically speaking, Russia loses without Ukraine. Look, you have a huge country. You have a lot of territories. You have a lot of tasks. You have huge population, enough people to keep you busy with their lives, with their comfort, I don't know, with their achievements, with your science, with your, I don't know what. With your energy, with your business. Why not? Why are you focusing so much efforts on history and not on present and not on the future? So you're not speaking about future, you're speaking about the past. I think that the age of Putin is also important if we try to answer the question why Putin, why Russia aggressed, really invaded Ukraine 3 months ago.
Invaded for the second time. So this is the second Ukrainian-Russian war, or Russia-Ukrainian war. Let's not forget. So coming back to this imperial question, the problem of Russia is that Ukraine is not only a colony for her, but it's a kind of a head of the empire. So without Ukraine, Russia feels as a kind of a headless empire. And I think this is very important to stress. Therefore, we try to describe Ukrainian history, Russian history in terms of imperialism, colonialism, but many parts of the framework to which we are accustomed to, like Western audience is accustomed to, are working here, but some of them are not working here. Because this imperialism is very specific. It's like a colony which became an empire tries to reconquer its head, its very core.
This classic definition of colony and empire is somehow different in our context, because this is not about a developed state which conquered a kind of different land and imposing this different state. This is a paradox why Ukraine became colony, because everything started here, but historically, this is not a paradox. There are clear historical explanations, because after the 11th century, there was Tatars coming here, destroying everything on their Mongols on their way, and then another center, different center, emerged in Moscow, and they ruined for some time here in Kiev, and then the second center became stronger, and then stronger enough to control the first place. So it's a complicated story, but this is not a colonialism in this, I would say, classical definition. But still, when we look in recent history, I mean, in the 19th century, it was a kind of a colony. And with many bans, with many rights, we were deprived of many rights. I mean, language, I mean, literature, all these Valuyev secular, all these other
Ems decree
limiting possibilities for Ukrainian culture and thus for Ukrainian identity. So, and it was Ukrainian culture was presented like a popular culture. And, culture of not educated people, peasants, and all these lowest class of people. And the high culture, I mean, in Russia, it was a kind of a high culture, noble culture. It was there. So this relationship started to be very present in 18th and 19th, maybe 19th century, more or less.
So we discussed two aspects. The first aspect is the post-Soviet times, and we try to explain why Russia invaded Ukraine right now, because our conclusion is that it is exhausted all other means, political, energy, soft power, informational, to conquer Ukraine. So military means is the only tool left. We also discussed kind of deeper history, also very superficially, of course, but we come back to it every time in our podcast, trying to explain that the relations, imperial colonial relations between Ukraine and Russia are complicated, and that Ukraine is perceived by Russia as a colony, but in fact it was for Russians, being Russia is kind of incomplete without conquering Kiev, without conquering Ukraine. And the third block, let's talk about this Russian imperialism. What is its specifics? Because it is also one of the reasons why Russia attacked. And I would say that it is also important first that Russia considers themselves as an empire. It's an idea of statehood was primarily imperial at the very beginning, not an idea of a certain territory, not an idea of a certain even dynasty, not an idea of certain, of course, not a nation state, but nations appeared much later in our sense of the term. But look at how they define themselves from the very beginning. Moscow, a third Rome. That means that this is a reference to something else, to something very far away, to a fantasy. And this reference to a fantasy is, I think, very, very important for Russia. So when Mr. Surkov is saying that if Russia does not expand, it will collapse, that also defines a certain element
Just
of
Dugin
this.
telling so. Dugin and Surkov as well?
No, I think both of them stress that Russia cannot be stable within its borders. It either expands or it will collapse.
It is a fantasy, and I would also stress that they quite empirically speaking, when we are asking question why it happened now in 2021, why it didn't happen in 2018 or 19 or 20, one of explanations which I find really maybe trustworthy is that COVID times and all this pandemia time, Putin became very much isolated. In a way, he was really physically isolated from real living creatures, I mean, from people. And maybe one of the explanations is that he started imagining these extremely unrealistic act like invasion of a neighbor. I mean, full-scale invasion. This is not like taking Crimea in a week without any blood. This is a different scale of operation. But he started believing his own fantasies about this Russia. I mean, Russia today, which is a kind of a strong but not so very strong country.
Much weaker than we thought.
Much weaker than before, and a kind of a regional power. Russia became with Putin a kind of a regional power, but not global one. After their losses in the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were not talking about Russia like a global leader. It was quite far from that. I mean, globally, geopolitically, Russia represented nothing like a real global leader. But he started dreaming, and all these ultimatums we've heard back in October, November about NATO, so go away because no an expansion of NATO, etc., etc. There were stories about him imagining Russia great again and just believing that to the point to send troops literally. So it was not virtual, it was literally sending troops, a lot of troops on Ukrainian border. And our idea that he will never proceed to act, but he did, because he started believing his fantasies.
Yes, this is one of this element of the Russian Empire right now. It's I tried to call it once or postmodern fascism, and then I understood that somebody else also did it. So it's probably not my invention, but some people think in the same categories. So it's a combination between very archaic forms of government and very like postmodern ideas when virtual world needs to conquer the real world.
Yeah.
Right. So this is also a war against reality, we can say. A very important thing is that it's not something that happened in Russia right now. It's really something which is in Russian political culture. This stress on imagination, this stress on fantasy, this mistrust to the reality, mistrust to empirical facts. Read Berdyaev, Nikolai Berdyaev, one of the big Russian philosophers, born in Kiev, by the way, which creates a certain ambiguity in his thinking towards Russia. He's very enthusiastic about Russia, but also very critical about Russia. The early 20th century thinker. So he described it in a very good way, this apocalyptic and fanatical and phantasmagoric nature of Russian culture. But it's and when we come back to this idea of a third Rome, this is precisely that. There was no empirical ground why would Moscow call itself a third Rome. It's an illusion to think that Russia will continue to expand. In the past century, maybe even in the past 2 centuries, Russia is shrinking. Russian imperial ambitions are getting smaller and smaller. In the 19th century, when it won against Napoleon, it was considering themselves as the enemy of all liberal thinking revolution in Europe. In the 20th century, when Soviet Union, with the help of Ukrainians, Belarusians, Georgians, Kazakhs, but also Russians, Jewish people, of course, defeated Nazism, Russians were able to say that, look, we are a great nation because we defeated Nazism, although they were not the only ones did. Now they're struggling to conquer Severodonetsk. Now they're struggling to conquer small villages on Donbass.
And they present it as a victory.
They don't even dream to conquer Kiev. They will probably try again, but right now it's a very distant fantasy. So Russia dreams to expand, but it's actually shrinking. It's an empire, it's a wounded empire, which gradually is losing its strength. And if we understand this, if we understand the logic of history right now, I think we should be afraid much less of Russia. This was a Explaining Ukraine podcast. this series about the war which Russia unleashed against Ukraine. We're making it together with Internews Ukraine and Ukraine Crisis Media Center, Tetiana Oharkova, myself, Volodymyr Yermolenko. You can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can listen to our podcast at Google, Apple, SoundCloud, and now increasingly we will be posting on YouTube as a video as well. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.